I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. SalubrisBio, rather than shying away from complexity, embraces it. The company's lead experimental therapy is an antibody fusion protein in development for both heart failure and the rare neurodevelopmental condition amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. We spoke to Sam Murphy, CEO of SalubrisBio, about the challenges of pursuing complex diseases with complex therapies, its pipeline, and how its China-based parent has provided it financial freedom from the vagaries of the capital markets. Sam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the invite. Really appreciate it.
We're going to talk about Salubris Biotherapeutics, its development of complex biologics, and its application across a broad range of deadly conditions like cancer, neurodegenerative, and cardiovascular diseases. Let's start with the company itself, though. This is a wholly owned subsidiary of China-based Salubris Pharmaceutical. Why did Salubris Pharmaceuticals create SalubrisBio, and does the purpose extend beyond issues of market access?
It definitely extends far beyond just market access. Salubris Pharmaceuticals in China began as a generics-focused company. At the time, China was really a branded generics market. And Salubris rose to prominence because they manufactured their generics to EU GMP standards, became known for their quality and developed that reputation, and eventually became the leading supplier of clopidogrel, which is a very commonly used cardiovascular drug in all of China by volume. And that was good enough for about $750 million a year in revenue, US dollars, and a healthy profit margin. But they saw very early on that the future was not in generics. The future was in innovative medicine. And they started to invest into innovation in China, and were one of the earliest domestic Chinese pharmaceutical companies to do that. But they also saw that the real heart of global biotech innovation is in the US. And so they set up SalubrisBio to be on the ground in the US and attract talent to develop some of the most innovative and exciting molecules out there in biotech today.
Well, how did the two companies interact? Is all of SalubrisBio's work conducted in the United States, or is there a collaboration across borders?
We do collaborate very closely. We have 3 clinical stage programs that I think we'll talk about, at least 2 of those today. We have the global rights to those molecules outside of Greater China, and our colleagues at an affiliate within China own the Greater China rights. So we are currently conducting a phase 2 study in heart failure, which includes sites in the US, Canada, and China. And we work closely with our colleagues in China to set up and monitor those sites as part of the global study.
There's been a lot of excitement recently around antibody drug conjugates. They're starting to make a big impact and were the focus of a lot of deal-making activity in 2023. Why do you think we've seen this interest emerge recently?
Well, I think we may have not completely exhausted the low-hanging fruit with monoclonal antibodies, but the possibilities for more carefully targeting specific molecules in the right level of potency and targeting drugs to specific cells like cancer cells is just tremendously enhanced with complex biologics and antibody drug conjugates relative to standard monoclonal antibodies. So I think you'll only see more and more complex biologics and antibody drug conjugates coming into the clinic in the future.
Your lead experimental therapy is JK07. This is in development to treat heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, as well as heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. How big a healthcare problem does this represent today?
Massive, in a word. So heart failure is really one of the leading causes of death in the US and globally. It's a condition that affects over 6 million people just in the US. 6 to 7 million is the estimate. And roughly 50% of those patients have the reduced ejection fraction form of the disease, and the other 50% have preserved ejection fraction. So we are targeting the entire patient population. If you have reduced ejection fraction, your life expectancy is it's 50% mortality 5 years from diagnosis. And for preserved ejection fraction, it's 50% mortality from first hospitalization. So a really significant healthcare problem today, and estimated to cause anywhere from 40 to 60 billion in economic impact as a result.
And how does the condition manifest itself or progress?
Well, for all of these patients, the initial symptoms are really shortness of breath and exhaustion, and specifically exhaustion on exertion or exercise-induced exhaustion. And as the disease progresses, they find it harder and harder to just go through the day. Climbing stairs becomes difficult. Just getting up off the couch and walking down the block becomes difficult. And that's why the disease tends to progress. And it's a negative feedback loop, because the less active these patients are, then the more their heart becomes unhealthy. And so our goal with JK07 is really to restore functional capacity and quality of life and improve the long-term outcomes of these patients by regenerating some of the function that they've lost.
What treatment options exist today, and how effective are existing therapies?
Well, we would have to talk about each form separately, because they're separate indications to date from the FDA standpoint. So reduced ejection fraction, there are a number of different therapeutic options available, and there's what's known as the 5 pillars of therapy. So they're relatively effective options in maintaining a patient's health status, and even in some cases helping them to feel better with chronic treatment. Most of those therapies relate to the volume overload that these patients experience. So when the heart isn't pumping very effectively, the fluid backs up, and that creates secondary problems. So any kind of diuretic, and diuretics are part of the pillars, or anything that relaxes the blood vessels to allow fluid to pump more easily, can have a positive effect on these patients. What is available for preserved ejection fraction is much more limited. There's essentially 2 drug classes that have shown an effect in those patients, and so they're in the greatest need of more treatment options. But collectively, across all the treatment options for reduced and preserved ejection fraction, there's not a drug yet that acts directly on the cardiomyocytes, which are the muscle cells in the heart, to strengthen, to restore the strength that they have in contracting and pumping, and relax the heart in a way that it can pump more effectively. It's all of the current drugs act indirectly on the heart rather than directly. JK07 does act directly on the heart, which is why we're so excited about the potential there.
Well, let's talk about JK07. This is an antibody fusion protein. Does the antibody component simply serve as a targeting mechanism, or does it provide any therapeutic benefit beyond that?
It does provide therapeutic benefit. It's certainly not just a targeting agent. It's a little bit of a complicated molecule and rationale for the design, but I'll try to explain it simply. So there is a growth factor called neuregulin, which is very fundamental for your heart. And if you knock it out in animals, you knock the gene out, then their heart doesn't develop, and it's embryonic lethal. And then we know it's clinically relevant because when a certain cancer therapy, Herceptin, which is pretty commonly used and one of the all-time greatest cancer therapies to be developed, when Herceptin is used, it sometimes causes a side effect of cardiomyopathy. And the reason it causes cardiomyopathy is it's blocking the signaling of this molecule, neuregulin. So, that means it's definitely clinically relevant. And based on that, a couple of companies took recombinant neuregulin and tried to use it to treat heart failure. And what they saw was really promising activity, but they also saw significant toxicity and safety concerns. And the reason for that is neuregulin binds to 2 different receptors. One is called ErbB4, which is really located within the heart and the nervous system. And the second receptor is called ERB3, and that is expressed systemically throughout in epithelial cells. And so their challenge was they didn't have a therapeutic window. They were getting activity, but they were also getting toxicity, and they couldn't separate them enough to get really good efficacy. JK07, coming back to your question, is the active form of neuregulin, or the active domain of neuregulin, fused to an antibody that blocks that ERB3 signaling. And it does so very effectively. It's a high affinity antibody. And so what we create then, in effect, is a selective ERB4 agonist. It's the first selective ERB4 agonist to go into the clinic. And our effects are very much predominantly within the heart and the nervous system, and not active systemically. So it's a completely different profile, and that's why we're really excited about its potential.
Well, what's known about it from studies you've conducted to date?
Well, the recombinant neuregulins showed improvement in ejection fraction in reduced ejection fraction heart failure patients. We've run 2 phase 1b studies and showed that our molecule also improves ejection fraction in heart failure patients with reduced ejection fraction. The phase 1b study we ran in the US, it included major academic medical centers. Our lead investigator, lead site was at Cleveland Clinic, which is one of the most renowned hospitals globally for treatment of cardiovascular conditions. And we saw at the highest dose level we've moved into phase 2, or our recommended phase 2 dose, we saw a 50% improvement in ejection fraction at the end of the study relative to baseline from just one single dose on the first day of treatment.
What's the development path forward?
Well, based on those findings and all of the non-clinical work that we've done, we have moved into a phase 2 study in heart failure. And in this study, we are including both reduced and preserved ejection fraction patients, 204 reduced ejection fraction and 78 preserved ejection fraction. And unlike the first study, which was a single dose, this study is a repeat dose study. So we expect to see even better efficacy. And we're evaluating 2 different dose levels. And we will have interim data that we're projecting to read out around the end of this year, and full top-line data around the end of next year.
Some people may be surprised to learn that JK07 is also in development for ALS. What's the connection between the two conditions? How does a potential therapy for heart failure have the ability to address a neurodegenerative condition?
I think it's really interesting that there is this molecule neuregulin that has such kind of profound effects on both the heart and the nervous system. And in fact, the molecule neuregulin got the name that begins NEUR because the original observations in research were that it helps to repair neurons. And it was only later that it was discovered it had any role in cardiovascular and myocardial function. So if you think about it just at a very basic level, there's 2 organ systems that are controlled by electrical stimulation, and those are the heart and the brain. And I think that's not necessarily intuitive, but they are very intrinsically linked in that way, as well as with proteins that affect signaling pathways that are common to both organ systems. But why ALS specifically is because, as I mentioned earlier, JK07 is the first selective ERB4 agonist to enter clinical development. And there are publications from around the world, including patients in US, Canada, Europe, Japan, and China, showing that mutations in ERB4 can cause ALS. So that's really intriguing in and of itself, because ALS is such a devastating disease with really very limited treatment options. And to be able to potentially increase the signaling of those partially defective receptors is just a logical treatment approach. But what really intrigued us is a larger genome-wide association study that showed that ERB4 mutations could play a role in as much as 50% of the cases of ALS or more. And so that's why we're quite interested, given that we've already run all of our GLP tox studies, we already have GMP material manufactured. It's relatively easy for us to initiate a phase 2 study in ALS patients and see if we can help those patients in addition to heart failure patients.
You have a separate antibody fusion protein in development for cancer, but I wanted to ask you about a different preclinical cancer program you have, JK06, which is a first-in-class biparatropic ADC. Can you contrast biparatropic antibodies from bispecific antibodies and the benefits they provide?
Sure. So a bispecific antibody is one that binds to two different targets, usually two different protein targets. A biparatopic antibody is one that binds to two different parts of the same protein target. And what's been shown consistently in preclinical studies is that when you use a biparatopic antibody, it creates aggregates at the cell surface because the antibodies kind of intercalate with the proteins that are clustered on the cell surface and create these clusters that are then internalized. So this is a particularly effective way of inducing internalization for receptors that otherwise poorly internalize. Some ADCs work by releasing the payload at the surface of the tumor cell and try to kind of induce a sort of bystander effect. But in order to have a clean safety profile, you ideally want the payload to be released only inside of the cancer cells. And that can only be done if internalization happens when the antibody binds. So a biparatopic approach is really ideally suited for receptors that inherently or innately poorly internalize.
Have you identified indications you'll be pursuing with this?
We are pursuing not all solid tumors, but those solid tumors that are known to have a higher expression level of the protein target that JK06 is specific for. And those include lung cancer and breast cancer and renal cancer. So some of the larger cancers, solid tumor cancers out there.
And when do you expect to be in the clinic?
We submitted our clinical trial application last month, and we expect that we will be all set up and ready to start dosing patients in Q3 of this year.
Would you expect to develop this as a monotherapy, or are there reasons to believe it might be synergistic with other types of therapies?
It could eventually be synergistic, but our intentions and near-term goal is to develop this as a monotherapy. We believe we'll see monotherapy activity. That's what we saw non-clinically. We have quite a wide therapeutic window. We saw literally no toxicity with our molecule as we ran the monkey tox studies in both the non-GLP setting as well as the GLP setting. So our near and medium-term aspirations are really as a monotherapy.
SalubrisBio calls its therapies complex. Do they present any additional design or manufacturing challenges than other ADCs or bispecific antibodies?
They do, and it's really through the entire chain of events and activities that are required to initiate clinical development. So if you start with the upstream manufacturing process and producing the molecules, it takes a lot more work to find a cell line that is going to produce these molecules at a high level and with the right biophysical characteristics that will enable long-term scalability and developability. And then once they're produced, you have to purify them. And when you have complex biologics, you often have many additional species as compared to standard monoclonal antibodies that you have to purify away from your own drug. And so the downstream process development is also more complicated. And then you have multiple specificities that you need to monitor in stability studies. And so the analytical development is also more complicated. And your pharmacokinetic assays have to monitor all of the different components of the molecules. So those are more complicated as well. So overall, definitely requires a more advanced team. We are, however, a very small team of only 30 people, as we now have 3 clinical trials active. And the core of our team, more than 50%, is CMC focused, because it is so critically important with these molecules to know from the beginning that you have a drug that is scalable and developable all the way through to commercialization.
Given that complexity, do you expect to be doing the manufacturing yourself?
Well, we do all of the early manufacturing development work internally, but then we do tech transfer out to CDMOs for GMP manufacturing because it's too much for us to take on at the moment to scale up to GMP manufacturing.
The company recently announced a $35 million infusion from your parent. Has that relationship freed you from the typical fundraising pressures young biotechs feel? And at some point, do you expect to seek capital from outside investors?
The answer to that is yes and yes. Our parent company, which is the sole shareholder at the moment, certainly appreciates that they are supporting us in a way that we don't need to spend an inordinate amount of time at the leadership level going out and looking for fundraising. In the same way you saw, I think, over the last decade and a half, that the Series A rounds became bigger and bigger from 25 average to 50 to 75. Now it's not uncommon to see 100 plus Series A's. And the idea has always been, you relieve the management team of needing to fundraise in the short term and allow them to focus on execution. And we've certainly been very focused on execution and have accomplished a lot over the last few years. However, at some point, the fundraising mechanism that we've used, which is being funded out of profits from the China-based parent company, would become more challenging. If we think about moving into phase 3 in heart failure, those studies could be hundreds of millions of dollars. And so we are in discussions with outside investors. And when we find the right time and the right terms and the right investors, I think you will see us bringing on more investors and putting ourselves in a position to access public capital markets in the future.
Sam Murphy, CEO of SalubrisBio. Sam, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the invitation.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.